There are moments in life that nobody plans for. Moments that arrive quietly, without warning, without fanfare, and yet they change everything. This is one of those moments. It did not begin with a shout or a cry for help. It did not begin with sirens or panic. It began with a small hand, a pair of frightened eyes, and a gesture so quiet that most people in that crowded place walked right past it without a second glance. But one man saw it. One man, standing at attention in full ceremonial uniform, doing the job he had done for 11 years without a single unusual incident, he saw it. And what happened next is something the people who were there that day still talk about. The morning of October 14th started like any other busy Tuesday at Windsor Castle. The autumn air had a sharp chill to it, and the leaves on the tall oak trees lining the outer courtyard were turning a deep amber and rust. Tourists had been gathering since early morning, camera straps around their necks, children pulling at their parents' sleeves, everyone eager to get a good look at the changing of the guard ceremony, one of the most watched and photographed traditions in all of Britain. Sergeant James Whitmore had stood his post at the eastern gate entrance for so many years that he no longer needed to think about where to place his feet or how to hold his body. His back was straight. His eyes moved in a slow, practiced sweep across the growing crowd. His tall black bearskin hat sat perfectly level. He was, to every tourist pointing a phone at him, nothing more than a living statue, a decoration of history and tradition. That was part of the job. You learned not to react. You learned to breathe slowly and let the world move around you like water around a stone. His name was James Whitmore, and he was 41 years old. He had joined the Foot Guards at the age of 19 after growing up in a modest terraced house in Coventry. His father had been a postman. His mother had worked part-time at a bakery. There had been no military tradition in his family, no grandfather with war medals, no uncle who had served. James had simply always felt drawn to discipline, to precision, to the idea of standing for something larger than himself. Over the years he had served in 2 overseas postings, earned several commendations for conduct, and had been quietly respected among his peers for his steadiness under pressure. He was the kind of man who did not talk much but who noticed everything. That morning he had arrived at his station at 6:45, gone through inspection without a single fault noted, and taken his position at the gate as the first tourist buses began to pull into the outer car park. By 9:15 the crowd had swelled considerably. School groups, families with young children, a large tour group from Japan with matching yellow hats, several elderly couples moving slowly with walking sticks, the usual mixture of people that gathered at Windsor on any given weekday. James kept his gaze moving. It was second nature. You did not stare at any one thing too long. You took in the whole picture in pieces, a slow visual survey that never stopped. That was when he first saw the girl. She was standing near the iron railing about 12 feet to his left, slightly apart from the main body of the crowd. She looked to be around 9 or 10 years old, small for her age, with dark brown hair pulled into 2 uneven pigtails. She was wearing a pale yellow jacket that was slightly too large for her, the sleeves coming down past her wrists. Her shoes were clean but simple, the kind of shoes you buy for practical reasons, not for fashion. She had no phone in her hand, which was unusual these days for a child her age. She was not taking photographs. She was not watching the ceremony. She was watching James. That was the first thing that made him take a longer look. Children often stared at the guards. That was normal. They would study the bearskin hat with wide eyes, sometimes poke their parents and whisper, sometimes wave hoping for a reaction. It was a game they played, see if you can make the guard smile. James had seen it thousands of times. But this child was not doing that. She was not staring at his hat or his uniform. She was looking directly at his face, and her expression was not curious or playful. It was something else entirely. It was the expression of a person trying very hard to get something across without making a sound. James continued his sweep, bringing his gaze back to the center crowd, but a part of his attention, the deeper, trained part, stayed on that girl. He let another 2 minutes pass. When his eyes returned to her position, she was still there. Still watching him. She had not moved to rejoin whatever adult she had come with. She was alone at the railing, and now he could see that her hands were gripping the iron bar in front of her with both fists, her knuckles pale against the dark metal. Then, she did something. She raised her right hand slowly, keeping it low, close to the railing, not lifting it high enough for anyone else in the crowd to notice. She made a fist, then extended her index finger and pointed not at James, not at the ceremony, but to her left, back into the crowd. Then, she dropped her hand quickly, as if she was afraid of being seen doing it. James did not react outwardly. Not a single muscle in his face moved. But, inside, something shifted. Something that 11 years of training had made sharp and reliable sent up a quiet signal. This was not normal child behavior. This was a child trying to communicate something specific, something she could not or would not say out loud, and she was doing it in a way that suggested she did not want whoever was behind her to know she was doing it at all. He performed another slow sweep, this time allowing his gaze to naturally travel in the direction she had pointed without making it obvious he was doing so. The crowd was dense in that section. He could see several adults in conversation, a few people consulting maps, a man eating from a paper bag, a woman adjusting a stroller. Then, about 20 feet into the crowd, he saw a man standing slightly apart from everyone else. He was heavy-set, with a short dark beard, wearing a gray jacket. He was not looking at the ceremony. He was looking at the girl. Not in the way a parent looks at a child who has wandered slightly ahead. Not with the casual half-attention of a guardian keeping a general eye on a young person in a crowd. He was watching her with a fixed, controlled stare, the kind of stare that was working very hard at looking relaxed but was not relaxed at all. When the girl did not move back toward him, James saw the man's jaw tighten slightly. James had been trained to recognize threat indicators. He had been trained to assess behavior in crowds. He had been trained to escalate without causing panic. He had also been trained, above everything else, to trust his instincts, because in his line of work, instincts were not random feelings. They were the sum total of everything he had ever observed and learned, processed faster than conscious thought. Every instinct he had was now fully awake. He did not break position. He did not call out. He did not alarm the hundreds of people standing around him enjoying their morning. What he did was use the discreet internal communications channel, a small covert earpiece and wrist-mounted button that ceremonial guards at royal residences carry specifically for exactly these kinds of situations. He pressed the button twice, which was the code for requesting eyes on my position without visible response, and spoke very quietly, barely moving his lips. Eastern Gate. Possible concern. Child, yellow jacket, iron railing left of my position. Adult male, gray jacket, 20 feet back in crowd, northeast quadrant. Request plainclothes confirm. The response came back in his earpiece within 40 seconds. Confirmed. 2 officers moving. During those 40 seconds, James did something that required every ounce of his professional training and personal self-control. He looked at the girl again, just briefly, just enough, and he gave her the tiniest, most barely perceptible nod. Not a formal movement. Not something anyone else would notice. Just a slow, deliberate drop of his chin by perhaps 2 millimeters, held for a fraction of a second longer than a natural blink, and then, back to attention. The girl saw it. He knew she saw it because something in her posture changed. Not dramatically. Not visibly to anyone who was not looking closely. But her grip on the iron railing loosened by the smallest degree, and the rigid set of her shoulders, the brace of a child holding herself very, very still under pressure, softened, just slightly, as if something inside her had let go of one small breath it had been holding. She was terrified. And she had been trying to tell him that for the last 4 minutes. And now, for the first time, she knew that someone had heard her. What James did not know yet, what he would only learn in the hours that followed, as the full picture was gradually assembled by the officers and child protection specialists who arrived on scene, was that the girl's name was Lily. She was 9 years old. She had been born in Leeds to a mother who had remarried 2 years earlier. Her stepfather's name was not Grey Jacket. That was not his name in the official reports either. But he was the man in the gray jacket. And he had brought her here on a day when her mother believed she was on a supervised school trip. He had not enrolled her in any school trip. He had driven her here himself, to a place crowded with strangers and cameras and distraction, to a place far from anyone who knew them, and, he had told her, in the car, in a voice she would describe later with the precise, flat clarity of a child recounting something that has been burned into memory, that if she made any noise or tried to talk to anyone, something very bad would happen to her mother. Lily had believed him. She had been believing him for 7 months. But, she had also been thinking, during those 7 months, about what she might do if she ever got the chance. She had watched enough television to know that policemen could help. She had been told by a teacher, back before things at home became what they became, that if you were ever in trouble and could not speak, you could signal. You could use your hands. You could use your eyes. Someone, somewhere, would be paying attention. She had not known, when she woke up that morning, that today would be the day. She had not planned what she would do or how she would do it. But, when her stepfather stopped to look at his phone near the outer gate and she found herself standing at the railing with a clear line of sight to the guard, this tall, still, watchful man in the enormous black hat, something in her had made a decision before her brain fully caught up with it. She had raised her hand. She had pointed. She had hoped. And, James Whitmore, sergeant of the Foot Guards, a man who had stood at this gate for 11 years and been mistaken for a statue by 10,000 tourists, had seen her. Back in the crowd, the man in the gray jacket had not yet noticed that anything was different. He was still watching Lily with that controlled, possessive stare, waiting for her to turn around and come back. He had a story ready, the same story he always had ready. She's my stepdaughter. She wanders sometimes. You know how kids are. A story smoothed by practice into something that sounded completely ordinary. He had used it before. In other places. With other people. It had always worked. He did not yet know that 2 plainclothes security officers had entered the crowd from opposite sides and were now moving toward him with the calm, unhurried purpose of people who knew exactly where they were going and why. He did not yet know that a child who had been silent for 7 months had just spoken, not in words, but in the oldest and most honest language there is. She had looked at someone and asked for help with her eyes. And the answer had come back. That was the beginning of what would become, in the weeks and months that followed, a case that traveled from a crowded castle courtyard all the way through the child protection system, the courts, and eventually into the national conversation about how children signal distress and how adults, all adults, not just trained professionals, can learn to see it. But none of that had happened yet. It was still just a Tuesday morning in October, with amber leaves and tourist cameras and a small girl in a yellow jacket standing at an iron railing. And she was not alone anymore. The 2 plainclothes officers moved through the crowd the way water moves through a narrow channel, without force, without resistance, barely disturbing the surface. To every tourist around them they were simply 2 more visitors at Windsor Castle on a Tuesday morning. One was a woman in a dark blue coat, her hair down, a small canvas bag over one shoulder. The other was a younger man in a brown jacket and jeans, hands in his pockets. Neither looked at the other. Neither made eye contact with James Whitmore standing at the gate. They had been briefed in 30 seconds flat through their earpieces, and they knew what they were looking for. They found him exactly where James had indicated. The man in the gray jacket, whose full name was Derek Allen Hurst, as the documents would record in the weeks that followed, was still standing in the northeast quadrant of the crowd, still watching Lily at the railing with that particular kind of attention that looks casual from 6 feet away and looks like something much darker from 6 inches. He had his phone out now, not really looking at it, using it as a prop. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Checked the phone again. Looked at the girl. Looked at the ceremony. Looked at the girl again. He was calculating. That was clear to both officers the moment they got eyes on him. He was doing the arithmetic of a man trying to decide whether it was time to intervene, whether the girl had been at the railing long enough that someone might notice, whether walking over to her right now would look normal or would look like exactly what it was. The female officer, whose name was Constable Rachel Okafor, slowed her pace by a fraction and positioned herself at a natural-looking angle to the man's left, as if she had stopped to look at something in the ceremony. She was close enough now to hear him if he spoke. The other officer, D.C. Paul Merritt, completed a casual arc that brought him to within about 8 feet of the man's right side. For another full minute nothing visible happened. The ceremony continued. The crowd continued to watch. Cameras clicked. A child somewhere behind the crowd laughed at something. Lily remained at the railing, not looking back, her hands still on the iron bar, her posture holding that careful stillness that James had already identified for what it was. Then, Derek Hurst put his phone in his pocket, pulled his jacket straight, and started walking toward the girl. Okafor moved at the same moment. Not running. Not with any urgency that would cause the crowd to turn and look. She simply stepped into the path between the man and the railing at a completely natural angle, as if she had spotted a good photo opportunity, and said pleasantly, "Excuse me, sorry, could I just squeeze through here for a moment?" Hurst stopped. He looked at her. His face was controlled, polite, slightly impatient. "Sure," he said. But Merritt was already beside him. "Mr. Hurst?" Merritt said quietly. The man's head turned sharply. His eyes went from Merritt to Okafor, and, in that single second, in the space between the last moment of his control and the first moment of his understanding that something had changed, his face did something involuntary. It dropped. Not for long. Just a fraction of a second. Just long enough for both officers to see exactly what was underneath the ordinary surface he showed to the world. "We'd like a word," Merritt said, still quietly, still calmly. "If you wouldn't mind stepping this way." He minded. It was obvious that he minded enormously. But he had enough self-control, even then, to understand that making a scene in the middle of a crowd at Windsor Castle was not in his interest. He went with them. Not pleasantly, not without a sharp, tense protest about his rights and a demand to know what this was about, but he went. At the railing, Lily had not moved. She was facing forward, her eyes on the guard in the tall hat, and she did not turn to look at what was happening behind her. She did not need to. She had felt the shift in the crowd's dynamics the way you sometimes feel a change in air pressure before a storm arrives, some low, wordless signal that the thing you have been dreading has been dealt with by someone who was not you. A third officer, a woman in civilian clothes who had approached from the opposite direction, specifically assigned to the child from the moment James had called it in, crouched down beside Lily at the railing and said softly, "Hi. My name's Karen. I work here at the castle. Are you okay?" Lily looked at her. Her face was still very careful, very controlled, the face of a child who has learned to be hard to read. But her eyes were full of something that had been pressed down for a long time, and Karen, who had been working in child protection liaison for 6 years, saw it immediately. "You're safe now," Karen said. "You were so brave." Lily did not cry. Not then. She would cry later, at the station, with a specialist present and a cup of hot chocolate going cold on the table beside her. But right then, standing at the railing at Windsor Castle with her hands finally unclenched from the iron bar, she simply nodded, the same small, barely there nod that James Whitmore had given her 8 minutes earlier, and said, in a voice that was very small and very steady, "I knew he would see me." She meant James. She had known, somehow, or had decided to believe, that the still man in the tall hat would see her. She had decided to trust it. In the most frightening situation of her 9-year-old life, she had taken the only action available to her and she had trusted a stranger to respond. And he had. That detail, "I knew he would see me," would be repeated in every retelling of the story, by the officers who were there, by the family liaison worker who spent the following weeks with Lily and her mother, by the judge who later referenced the case in his sentencing remarks. It was the detail that made people stop. Because there is something in those 6 words that cuts right to the heart of what trust means, what courage means, and what it costs a child to reach across everything they have been taught to fear and ask for help from a stranger. Lily's mother, whose name was Sandra, learned what had happened in a phone call that came just after 11 that morning. She was at work, a dental receptionist's office in Leeds, and she took the call at the front desk because she did not recognize the number and thought it might be the school. It was not the school. It was a family liaison officer from Thames Valley Police, speaking in that particular tone that trained professionals use when they are about to say something that will change the structure of a person's life. Sandra did not remember the exact words later. She remembered dropping her pen. She remembered one of her colleagues coming around the desk and putting a hand on her arm. She remembered the sound of the rain starting against the office window, which was not something she normally noticed. She had not known. That was the unbearable fact that she would sit with for months, in therapy sessions and, in the middle of the night and, in the car during the long drive to Leeds from Windsor, where she went that day to collect her daughter. She had not known what was happening in her own home, to her own child, under the roof of the man she had married 2 years ago in a register office ceremony with 16 guests and a pale pink dress. She had not known, and Lily had not told her. Not because Lily did not want to. Not because Lily did not love her. But because Derek Hurst had been very, very careful about the architecture of the fear he had built around this child, and one of its central load-bearing walls was the threat to her mother. If you tell her, something will happen to her. If you make any noise, I will make sure something happens to her. You are the only thing standing between your mother and something very bad. Your silence is what keeps her safe. It is one of the oldest and most effective tools of the kind of person Derek Hurst was. It turns love into a cage. It takes the most powerful feeling a child has, the need to protect the people they love, and weaponizes it. It tells a child that their silence is an act of love, that speaking is an act of destruction. Lily had believed it for 7 months. She had carried it to school and to bed and to every dinner table where she had sat across from the man who had told her this, watching him be ordinary and pleasant and completely unremarkable to everyone around him. She had carried it here, to Windsor Castle, on a day when she should not even have been here, brought by a man whose stated intention, as he had told Sandra, was a routine trip to see a friend in Slough. There was no friend in Slough. The case that began at the eastern gate of Windsor Castle on the morning of October 14 moved quickly through the initial stages of investigation, in the way that cases involving children in immediate danger tend to do when the evidence is clear and the responding officers are experienced. Derek Hurst was taken to a local police station for questioning that morning. He was calm. He was cooperative in the surface way that practiced manipulators tend to be cooperative, agreeing with the broad shape of things, deflecting on the specifics, employing the full repertoire of the wrongly accused, the confusion, the mild offense, the repeated expressions of concern for his stepdaughter's well-being, the careful deployment of the word family. He had answers for everything. How they came to be at Windsor that day, a spontaneous decision. Lily had been asking to see the guards for months, he was just doing something nice for her. Why Sandra did not know about the trip, a miscommunication, she was very busy at work, he had meant to text her. Why Lily had gone to the railing alone, she had wandered ahead, you know how kids are, he had been keeping an eye on her the whole time. Every answer was smooth. Every answer was plausible, taken alone. Every answer was the kind of answer that, in another set of circumstances, might have been entirely true. But they had Lily's account. Given separately, given carefully, given in the presence of a specialist child interviewer trained specifically in how to talk to children without leading them or frightening them or closing down the lines of communication that they have often spent months or years keeping sealed. The interview took 3.5 hours, conducted in 2 sessions with a break in between. The interviewer was a woman named Dr. Patricia Yu, and she had been doing this work for 17 years. What Lily told Dr. Yu, in her own words, in her own order, with her own hesitations and backtracks and the particular kind of precision that children sometimes have when recounting things that were painful enough to carve themselves permanently into memory, was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the careful, measured language of the case file, a consistent, detailed, and credible account of sustained emotional and psychological abuse, including elements of coercive control, isolation, and threat-based manipulation of a minor over a period of not less than 7 months. In plain English, this child had been living in fear in her own home for the better part of a year, and she had found a way to ask for help with her hands and her eyes on a Tuesday morning in October, and a guard at a gate had been paying attention. James Whitmore was not present for any of this. He was back at his station by the time Derek Hurst was in a police vehicle and Lily was being driven to a safe location. The ceremony had continued around him, as ceremonies do, unbothered by the drama that had unfolded 8 feet to his left, invisible to most of the tourists who had been there. A few people near the railing had noticed the quiet approach of the officers. A few had glanced over at the girl in the yellow jacket and, then, back at the ceremony. Nobody had understood what was happening. That was the point. James finished his shift at 1 o'clock, was debriefed by a senior officer in a private room at 1:20, gave a full account of what he had observed and when and how he had responded, and was back home by 3:30. He did not tell his wife everything that day. Not because it wasn't important, but because there was still a great deal he didn't know. The outcome was still unfolding, the case was active, the details were not his to share. He said simply that something had happened at work, something that mattered, and that he would tell her more when he could. She knew him well enough to ask only one question. Is the child okay? He thought about Lily at the railing. He thought about the tiny, careful signal she had sent across 12 feet of crowded courtyard. He thought about what it had cost her to make it and what it meant that she had made it anyway. She will be, he said. The weeks that followed were not simple. They never are, in cases like this. There is a tendency, when people hear a story with a clear rescue and a clear villain and a clear ending, to imagine that the ending is clean, that the bad thing stops and the good thing begins, and everything settles into place like the final frame of a film. That is not how it works. That is almost never how it works, and it was certainly not how it worked for Lily and Sandra in the autumn and winter that followed the morning at Windsor Castle. Sandra had moved out of the family home within 48 hours of the phone call at the dental office. She and Lily went first to Sandra's sister's house in Wakefield, which was small and already full but immediately offered and immediately accepted. There were 2 nights on an air mattress in the spare room that smelled of paint, and then a temporary council placement in a flat 3 streets away, and then, by the end of November, a more permanent arrangement in a different part of Leeds, a different school catchment, a different bus route, a different set of streets that did not have the specific weight of the previous 2 years pressed into every pavement crack. Sandra went back to work after a week. Not because she felt ready. Because she needed the structure, and because sitting in the flat with her thoughts was something she could only do for so long before the thoughts became unbearable. Her colleagues were kind in the way that people who do not quite know what to say are sometimes kind, careful, slightly over-solicitous, making tea without being asked, not mentioning anything directly. She was grateful for it. Lily went back to school after 2 weeks. Her teacher, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Calloway who had been teaching Year 4 for 12 years, had been briefed carefully by the school's safeguarding lead about the broad shape of what had happened, without specific details. He had simply moved Lily's seat to a position by the window, stocked a small drawer in his desk with the particular brand of colored pencils she liked, and made a point of saying good morning to her by name every single day without fail, in a voice that carried nothing except genuine warmth. Small things. The kind of small things that feel enormous when you are 9 years old and your world has been turned upside down and you are trying to figure out what is safe and what is real and who can be trusted. Lily progressed through this period with a steadiness that surprised the adults around her, and then surprised them less as they came to understand her better. She was, as Dr. Patricia Yu noted in her ongoing assessment reports, a child of significant inner resilience, not the performed toughness of a child who is shut down, but the genuine, hard-won resilience of a child who had decided, somewhere in the depths of a very frightening experience, that she was going to find her way through it. She had demonstrated that at Windsor Castle. She continued to demonstrate it through every step of what followed. She asked, one evening in early November, whether she could write a letter to the guard. She asked this carefully, in the way she asked most things, not pushing, not demanding, but with a particular quality of earnestness that made you understand this was not a casual request. Sandra called the family liaison officer, who passed the request through appropriate channels, and the response came back that yes, it could be arranged. Lily wrote the letter at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning. She used her best handwriting, which was careful and slightly uneven and completely legible. She crossed out 2 things and rewrote them. She used a blue pen because she thought it looked more serious than the purple one she normally used for school. The letter was 4 paragraphs long. She did not share it with her mother before she sent it. Sandra only learned what was in it later, secondhand, because James Whitmore mentioned it when he was eventually asked to participate in a child safety awareness event organized in part because of this case. He read a portion of it, with Lily's permission, facilitated through the liaison officer, because he said it was the most important thing anyone had ever said to him in his professional career, and he felt it deserved to be heard. The part he read was this: I was scared for a long time, but I was also thinking the whole time. I thought that someone would notice if I was clever about it. My teacher told us once that brave does not mean not scared. It means doing something even when you are scared. I was very scared. But I did it anyway because I thought you looked like someone who was paying attention. The room in which he read it, a conference hall at a children's services building in London, full of social workers and police officers and school safeguarding leads and healthcare professionals, was quiet in a way that rooms rarely are. He folded the letter back up and put it in his breast pocket and said, simply, "That's why we pay attention." The legal proceedings against Derek Hurst moved through the courts over the following months. He had maintained his innocence through the initial investigation with a persistence that his defense team would eventually suggest to him was not serving his interests. By February, faced with the weight of Lily's testimony, the supporting evidence gathered from the family home, the accounts of 2 other adults who had witnessed his behavior toward Lily on previous occasions and who now came forward, and a forensic analysis of his phone and email records that told a story he had no clean explanation for, his legal representation changed their advice significantly. He entered a guilty plea in March to charges of child cruelty, coercive and controlling behavior, and causing a child to suffer unnecessary suffering under Section 1 of the Children and Young Persons Act. The sentencing took place in April and was covered in the national press, though not extensively, partly because by then, other large stories were occupying the front pages, and partly because Lily's identity was protected and, without the child's story being fully told in public, the case was reduced in the reporting to a series of dry legal facts that did not convey what had actually happened in that courtyard on a Tuesday morning in October. The judge's sentencing remarks were notable. He addressed, in direct terms, the particular cruelty of using a child's love for her parent as a mechanism of control. He said that the use of threat and manipulation to prevent a child from seeking help was among the most calculated forms of harm he encountered in his court, because it turned the child's own instincts against them. He said that the courage shown by the child in this case, and he used the word courage deliberately and without qualification, was a reminder that even in the most deliberately constructed circumstances of fear and isolation, the human impulse toward safety and help does not extinguish. It finds a way. Derek Hurst was sentenced to 4 years and 8 months. Sandra, in the months that followed, undertook a process of reconstruction that was harder in some ways than the acute crisis had been. The acute crisis had a shape, it had a before and an after, it had action and movement and the particular clarity that emergencies sometimes bring. The reconstruction was slower and less defined. It was therapy twice a week and paperwork and the recurring, grinding question of how she had not seen it, how she had lived inside the same house and looked at the same faces and missed what her daughter had been carrying. It was a question that had no satisfying answer and that her therapist helped her understand did not need one, or rather, that the answer was not a simple one, and not one that reflected on her as a mother. Predatory people who target families are skilled at exactly this, making themselves invisible to the adults they need not to see them while making themselves entirely present to the children they have selected. Sandra had been managed as carefully as Lily had been managed, in different ways, with different tools. That understanding helped. It did not make the weight disappear. It made it possible to carry it. By the summer, Lily was doing well. Not performing well, not the adults around me need me to be okay, well, actually well, in the way that children can sometimes be when the danger has genuinely been removed and the support around them is genuine and consistent. She had made a close friend at her new school, a girl named Petra who shared her enthusiasm for a particular series of fantasy novels and who had an infectious, booming laugh that Lily found deeply reassuring for reasons she could not fully articulate. She had started attending a weekly art group at a community center 3 streets from the flat. She had, with Sandra's encouragement and a great deal of quiet nervousness on Sandra's part, begun seeing a child therapist every 2 weeks, a process Lily approached with the same careful, practical earnestness she brought to most things. She talked about the castle sometimes. Not with anxiety, more with a kind of proprietorial pride, the way you talk about a place where something important happened to you. She told Petra about it, in her own version, which was accurate in the important ways and slightly embellished in a few details that made for a better story without changing the truth of what had occurred. Petra had listened with enormous eyes and, then, declared that Lily was the bravest person she had ever met in her actual real life, which had made Lily laugh in a way that was real and unguarded. James Whitmore, for his part, received a formal commendation from his regiment in January, a quiet affair, conducted without publicity at the request of all parties involved, given the ongoing legal proceedings and the privacy of the child involved. He accepted it with the same steadiness with which he approached everything in his professional life. He said that he had done what he was trained to do and what any person paying proper attention would have done. When pressed, because the officer presenting the commendation pressed him, gently, because the story deserved more than a modest deflection, he said something slightly different. He said that the credit did not belong to him. He said it belonged to the child who had decided, in the most frightened moment of her life, to try. He said that he had simply been standing in the right place and had the sense to listen to what was in front of him. He said that the job of a guard is not decoration. It is presence. It is paying attention. It is the understanding that being still and watchful is not the absence of action, it is the readiness for it. He paused for a moment, and then added, almost to himself, "She trusted me before she had any reason to. That's not a small thing. I don't want to ever be someone who doesn't deserve it." The story of Lily and James Whitmore became, in the year that followed, a quiet but recurring reference point in several connected fields. In child safeguarding training across several regional authorities, the case was introduced as an example of what specialists called nonverbal disclosure, the way in which children who have been threatened into silence find alternative routes to communicate distress. It illustrated, with a clarity that textbook case studies often lack, how a child who has been explicitly told not to speak can use gesture, positioning, eye contact, and targeted behavior to reach out to a trusted adult, or in Lily's case, to a stranger she had decided to trust. The case also traveled into public awareness work in ways that were deliberately low-key, to protect Lily's privacy. Articles were written without her name or specific identifying details. Training materials referenced the broad facts. The National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children cited it in guidance about public vigilance. The guidance noted that children in dangerous situations often cannot shout for help, that they may be in public spaces, surrounded by people, with a perpetrator close by, and that their signals will be subtle, easily missed, easily explained away. It said, pay attention to children who look at you for too long. Pay attention to children who are very still when the situation around them calls for movement. Pay attention to children who seem to be trying to communicate without words. Pay attention to the gap between what a face is showing and what the eyes inside it are actually saying. James Whitmore read this guidance when it was sent to him for comment. He read it twice. Then, he sent back one line. "This is exactly right. Teach it to everyone." Sandra read about the guidance months later, in an article she found online at 11 at night when she could not sleep. She sat with her phone in the kitchen of the flat in Leeds for a long time after she finished reading. Then, she went to Lily's room and stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her daughter sleep, the easy, unguarded sleep of a child who was finally safe, and she felt the full weight of everything that had happened and everything that had not happened, the terrible near miss of it, the thing that would have continued and worsened and gone on if a small girl had not decided to raise her hand. She went back to the kitchen and made a cup of tea and sat with it until it was cold. In the morning, Lily came downstairs in her school uniform and found her mother at the kitchen table looking tired but steady, the particular steady that Sandra had been building all year, constructed out of therapy sessions and the kindness of her sister and the daily fact of her daughter needing breakfast and lunch packed and someone to say have a good day at the door. Lily sat down across from her and poured her cereal and ate in the companionable quiet of people who know each other well enough not to need to fill every silence. Then, she looked up and said, out of nowhere, the way children sometimes produce the exact right thought at the exact right moment, "Mom, I want to learn how to do sign language." Sandra looked at her daughter. Yeah. So if I'm ever somewhere again and I can't talk, I have more things I can do." Sandra put down her mug. She thought about this. She thought about a small girl in a yellow jacket at an iron railing, hands pale against dark metal, making a decision that took more courage than most adults ever have to find in a lifetime. "Okay," she said. "We'll find a class." Lily nodded and went back to her cereal, satisfied, already moving on to the next thing, the way children do when they have made a decision and are done with it, and the rest is just detail. Sandra watched her for a moment longer than she needed to. Some things you cannot protect your children from. Some things will happen anyway, in the spaces between your watching, in the time it takes to answer a phone or trust the wrong person or simply not know something you had no reason to know. The world is too large and too unpredictable and too full of people who look ordinary from the outside. But some things you can do. You can teach a child that their voice, in whatever form it takes, in words or gestures or the direction of a small pointed finger, is worth using. You can teach them that strangers can be trusted, carefully, strategically, in a moment of need. You can teach them that being frightened does not mean being helpless. You can teach them sign language in a weekly class on Thursday evenings, starting in September. And you can stand at a gate for 11 years, still and watchful, and be exactly the kind of person who deserves the trust of a child who has nothing left to give but a silent signal and a hope. That is enough. It turns out that is more than enough.